exalted. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Good morning. So to bring you up to speed, if you missed the last 2 weeks of our message series, that we started off by saying that as human beings, we have the freedom to act and react to life. God's gifts are given to us, and it's up to us to take responsibility to acknowledge that. When we do respond, that's what is called prayer. So for the last 2 weeks, we've been looking at responding to God through prayer. Talked about prayer of thanksgiving, like the 10th leper who came and returned to say thank you. Last week, we looked at how we respond to God when it might seem that God is not even listening to us or ignoring us. We said that at those times, it's our responsibility to keep on praying and keep on praying and keep on praying, like the persevering widow. God may seem silent, prayer may not seem to be making any difference, but that's precisely when we need to persevere. Today we're going to dig down a little bit deeper into these reflections by turning to the story that Jesus told his friends and followers. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisees were the rabbis or teachers of Jesus' day. They were also the enforcers and interpreters of the Jewish law. They lived according to the letter of the law and expected everyone else to do the same. They believed that they were better than others. The name Pharisee itself means one who stands apart. The tax collectors, though, were at the opposite end of the social spectrum, considered to be the worst possible people. Jews lived under Roman rule, but the Romans got Jews to collect the taxes for them. Here's how they did it. That if you get yourself appointed as tax collector in a certain district, you collect the tax that's set by Rome, but you also have your own tax on top of that, which you get to pocket. Tax collectors were always the wealthiest people in any community, but everybody knew that theirs was a dishonest wealth. They were despised by average Jews. And because they were so despised, they tended to just give up on the whole religion and God thing and pretty much live selfish lives. They were set apart, but for a different reason. So this person who's all about the laws of the church and the biggest sinner who ever dared to show up at church showed up at exactly the same time. The Pharisee stood up and spoke this prayer to himself. God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortionists, unjust, adulterers, or even like that tax collector. I fast twice a week and I pay tithes on my whole income. But the tax collector stood off at a distance and wouldn't even lift his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." That's the picture that Jesus paints. And his audience was probably saying, so what's your point? Then he goes on to tell them, I tell you, this man, rather than the other, went home justified. You mean the tax collector guy? The guy left with a better relationship with God than the perfect Pharisee. So how exactly does that work? The key to the whole story comes at the very beginning when Jesus told this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else. The Pharisee approached God convinced of his own righteousness. In other words, he was self-righteous. Self-righteous people think that their actions make them not only good, but better than others. Rather than using good work and service as a platform for prayer to look up to God, the posture they adopt while doing the right thing is to look down on everybody else. It's physically impossible to look up to God when you're looking down on your fellow human beings. In fact, the gospel even said it. The Pharisee stood up and spoke this prayer to himself. He wasn't even praying to God. He was talking to himself. He approached God as if he didn't need him. The tax collector approached God as if he did. The effectiveness of our prayer doesn't depend on our performance or our actions, but on the condition of our heart. It's good deeds and virtuous habits that follow from prayer create a very useful platform for deeper and ever more effective prayer. But the effectiveness of our prayer depends on a contrite heart turned toward God. One that acknowledges that God is God and we are not. There's nothing we can do to save, redeem, or justify ourselves. The effectiveness of our prayer begins with this recognition. That's why the tax collector's prayer is the very best way to begin. It's how we begin prayer each and every Sunday here at Mass. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner, and glory to God because you're great. Today I want to lay out 3 possible applications for us to make use of this message and to ask you to choose one of them. First, for those that are already consistent in prayer, or even just trying to be, I ask you to look at your own routine and make sure that the Pharisee's prayer isn't creeping into your prayer life. Ask God to remove from your heart any indication that you're doing it to earn your own way into heaven or to look down on anyone else. For those who need to pray the tax collector's prayer, just do it. Do it here today at Mass. Acknowledge your need for Christ in your life. If that's you, give yourself the opportunity to pray like the tax collector. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And third, I invite all of us to come to confession. That if you haven't been in a long time, then now's a good time to come back. Don't worry about what to say, that the priest there will help you. We have confessions here every Saturday at 3:15 p.m. in the chapel. That every one of us has fallen short of God's glory. On our own, we have nothing to recommend us to God. Any prayers we offer which are based on our own performance are worthless. The good news is that God doesn't base his answer to our prayers on our performance, but on Jesus' performance on the cross. It's our responsibility to acknowledge those sins, to own them, and to confess them, so that we can receive the abundant mercies of the cross.